Today, I am thrilled to have Dr. Robert Keith Wallace, PhD, joining me to explore the intersection of consciousness, health, and human potential. In today's episode, we delve into the insights from Dr. Wallace's book, The Physiology of Consciousness, and discuss how understanding the physiology of consciousness can empower us to lead healthier, more fulfilling lives. Throughout our conversation, we'll explore Dr. Wallace's pioneering research on the physiological correlates of transcendental consciousness, the role of practices like transcendental meditation in optimizing brain function and well-being, and the integration of the principles of Maharishi Ayurveda with modern medicine. We'll also touch upon topics such as neuro-hacking, habit change, and reaching full human potential. You don't want to miss this episode, as it is packed with practical insights and strategies to support your personal growth and holistic health. A little background about Dr. Wallace. He is a scientist, researcher, and author of over 18 books, who has made significant contributions to the fields of neuroscience, physiology, and holistic health. With a PhD in physiology from UCLA, he has dedicated his career to exploring the intricate relationship between mind, body, and consciousness. Dr. Wallace's journey into the realm of holistic health began early in his career, sparked by his fascination with the ancient wisdom traditions of Ayurveda and meditation. Over the years, he has become a leading authority on the integration of these ancient principles with modern scientific understanding. Currently, Dr. Wallace serves as chair of the Department of Physiology and Health at Maharishi International University, where he continues to lead groundbreaking research and academic programs aimed at bringing holistic approaches to mainstream recognition. He is also a respected member of the university's Board of Trustees, having previously served as its first president. And without further ado, here we have Dr. Robert Keith Wallace. This is our sixth interview. We've covered so many topics, intriguing topics, neurohacks, biohacks, habit change. Today, we're going to delve into a book that hails from over 30 years ago, The Physiology of Consciousness. Maybe this book is the foundation of it all. I have a feeling it is. But anyway, this book was published a long time ago. And you've done a lot of writing since then, especially in the more popular, accessible, practical realm. If you were to write this book today, would you do anything different?
Well, it's an interesting question because I realized when I wrote this book that it was too theoretical. And so I actually took this book and broke it into two other parts, which is, kind of fascinating that you would take one book. I realized it was just too much. And so I took the book and did two new books based on it. One was an introduction to transcendental meditation, and one was a book on Maharishi Vedic technologies. So one book was really on TM and it was kind of my story, because I would tell stories at the beginning of each chapter. So, one of the stories was, visiting the dictator Somoza in Nicaragua in the middle of a revolution. So that story, fit into the first book. And then the second book was all about Maharishi Ayurveda, and, my stories of going with Dr. Triguna to National Institutes of Health. So you can find this book as the older version of it on Amazon, and it's one book, or you can find it newly published as two separate books. And in the earlier book, I was very, very head on into all the latest terminology that Maharishi was using. So the book really delved into the theoretical aspects of the knowledge of Maharishi Vedic science. And to me, it was kind of interesting. You talk about physiology, okay, that's one thing. But then there's a whole other mechanics of consciousness are going on. And that's what Maharishi had talked about. So I divided the book into the physiology of consciousness and the physiology of matter. And, obviously they're interconnected. But from the point of view of Maharishi's Vedic science, it's more of the traditional view that you find in the Vedic literature, especially Sankhya. It's a particular branch of the Indian philosophy. And it takes the point of view that everything comes from consciousness. This is not a Western point of view. Most Western neuroscientists would say, oh, consciousness, that's an epiphenomenon of the nervous system. So you evolve from animals up to humans, and when you get to the human, the nervous system is so complex that suddenly consciousness emerges, and it was never there before. And that's the kind of standard Western scientist point of view. But the Vedic point of view is no, everything is consciousness. Consciousness is primary, and matter is a later manifestation. And, Ayurveda identifies all these different levels. Sankhya identifies these. There's 5 elements, there's 3 doshas, so forth. And so it's a different perspective. So I wrote the book to kind of give both these 2 different perspectives. And so I get very theoretical in it. I don't hesitate.
It's definitely a book that's challenging to read, no doubt. I'm actually curious because your evolution as a writer and the materials that you've written, especially in the last 10 years, your books are, neuro-hacking, biohacking, habit change, just very accessible, very much the layperson can jump right in. There's practical things that they can really carry into their daily lives. But this book is sort of the background for all of that. In the way that you've written in the last 10 years, that accessible way, let's say you were to write the Physiology of Consciousness today, and I know it's rewritten in the 2 books that you referred to.
Right.
So what would the title be, number one? And how would it be different? Let's come into 2024. Or would it be different at all?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I wrote it for the students at Maharishi International University when I first wrote it, who I wanted to give them the complete analysis of Maharishi's knowledge as I understood it. Because, I had a very specific audience I was writing it for, which was not the general public. I was writing it for people who really wanted to go deep and wanted to know what the latest that Maharishi said. And there were things in it that were really fun because I took things from Maharishi, where he'd talk about the Vedic scientist. I mean, it was so cool. He said the Vedic scientist would cognize the laws of nature. His laboratory was the mind. His instrument was the nervous system. And he could hear the hum within each cell. So I was like, I love that stuff. So I wanted people to know about that because where can you hear about it? I heard about it in lectures from Maharishi, often in private situations. And I wanted people to know how cool this was and how deep it was and how special it was. So I had a, audience I was writing for. When I later rewrote the books, I was trying to change some of the terms. So because, there's a vocabulary that Maharishi used, Rishi Devata Chantas, over and over again. And it's simply knower, known, and process. Well, knower, process of knowing, and known. But it's so much deeper than that. So, I had to assume that most people don't know that vocabulary. And when you hear it, it's going to go right over your head. So I spent a lot of time in the book trying to, in the first version of the book, to establish what that was and what's its relevance.
Significance. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Well, the title of the book, There's a
So I'm not sure
subtitle
I
as
would
well.
change anything. I would still
Okay,
want that. I would still want that same book for those people that wanted to go deeply. And for
sure.
people that didn't want to go deeply, I wrote it into two books, which I took out Rishi Dev. I took out a lot of those terms uh, and made them simpler. So I kind of did what you're saying because I understood that the first book really had a certain specific audience, but that I wasn't going to be for the general public. Both books have
Sure.
lots of stories. Both books have, similar knowledge, but I just tried to make it more accessible in the second book and not so that it's terminology. Ultimately,
Absolutely. There's a language that there may be some unfamiliarity with. But the book has a subtitle which I want to read, and that is the title is The Physiology of Consciousness, but the subtitle is How Maharishi's Vedic Physiology and its Practical Application, Maharishi Ayurveda, can solve the problems of individual and collective health and raise life to a new level of fulfillment. Boy, that's a mouthful. Now,
it is. It is. It's a good one.
okay, in a very quick fashion, can you summarize that subtitle
You
and
just
and the
told me it's a
meaning of it?
mouthful, and then I have to summarize it quickly.
You know,
Yeah, no, it's true. All of Maharishi's knowledge had a practical outcome. He introduced TM not for the theoretical basis of it, so people could have more energy, more creativity, could be healthier. He introduced Ayurveda primarily not as a kind of theoretical tool, but as a practical tool to as preventative medicine to improve your health. He introduced all the programs in collective consciousness, not as some theoretical knowledge, but he produced groups around the world that would create coherence in collective consciousness. So everything Maharishi did had a practical outcome, but it also had a deep theoretical background. I tried to combine the two of those in that book, which may be too much, I don't know. But it was, I tried to give a little of both the theoretical background and the practical outcome. So that was why I had that subtitle to emphasize that it wasn't just theoretical knowledge, but everything that Maharishi did had a practical basis to it.
and that's what we're really looking for is how is this going to be how's it going to show up in our lives? How is this information useful and practical? You use the term Vedic paradigm in the book.
Yeah, I like that
What do
word.
you mean by that?
Well, Thomas Kuhn did this whole thing about paradigm, and it became kind of a fun topic for people to talk about. It's the world view we live in. So, for example, the world view would say, our current worldview would say that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of a complex nervous system. That's what everybody thinks. They don't think of the world as being made of consciousness. They think of consciousness as something that comes out. And, there's hundreds of philosophical discussions. There are all kinds of things. Dr. Tony Nader, in his books and his interviews, has really, really gone deeply into this and talked with top philosophers and everything. But it's the Vedic paradigm is a very particular paradigm where you change the worldview. It's not the modern Western scientific paradigm. It's a paradigm where consciousness is primary and matter is secondary, which is the exact opposite of the current paradigm we're living in now. So it's a worldview, and it's based on partly belief, partly theoretical understanding, and partly on practical experience. So if you practice transcendental meditation, you get the practical experience. If you study any of Maharishi's knowledge, you get the theoretical basis to it. And so that gives you a way of verifying that it's not just a belief, it's not a religion, but it's a new scientific understanding of the world, which has an experimental component and a theoretical component. And that's sort of what Maharishi spent his life doing, was showing us that the Vedic knowledge was not Hinduism or religion, but it was something more fundamental. It was an examination of nature, which in this book I called a Vedic paradigm, a different worldview based on real experience of people that went deeply into it and with a theoretical basis. So that was my idea, to try to just show it wasn't a belief system, but it was a scientific paradigm, but a Vedic scientific paradigm.
Great. Thank you for that. On 25 of your book, page 25, I want to just read something that's in the book about the levels of the mind that you wrote about. You said the basic level of the mind is the self with the capital S, the universal field of pure consciousness. From the self, the next level of subjectivity arises: ego, intellect, mind, and senses. The ego is the deepest level of individuality. Here resides the faintest level of feeling, which involves intuition and the individual's basic values. The third level is the intellect, which is responsible for discrimination. The intellect functions both as a decision maker and controller for selective attention. Arising from the intellect is the fourth level of the mind. In Maharishi Vedic science, the term mind, in its broadest sense, refers to all levels of the subjective physiology. However, here, mind refers to the mental structure, which is concerned with memory and association. But the fifth and most expressed level are the five senses, which process all incoming information from their environment. Now, this is very different than the way we think about the levels of mind, essentially the levels of mind from a Western perspective. Why is this important? Why is it important to have these layers?
Well, this is, again, part of the Vedic paradigm. It establishes, number one, that consciousness is fundamental. It's the unified field of what we talk about as the unified field of matter. They talk about as the unified field of consciousness. They equate these two as the same. So what we talk about as the fundamental basis of everything in creation, they say, well, it's really consciousness. So that gets established first and foremost. And then from there, you need to kind of explain how the different levels of creation arise. And since consciousness is primary, the first levels of creation that arise are subjective. They're mental, because that's, in this paradigm, that is the basis. This subjective gives rise to objective. Consciousness gives rise to matter. But even the subjective has different levels. So there can be a unified field, and then as that unified field, just as in physics, as that manifests in terms of elementary particles or forces, in the manifestation of consciousness, it manifests into specific levels of which are subjective, in this case, of the mind. And again, in a Western sense, we wouldn't think of ego as being something that is equivalent to an elementary particle or elementary force. But in the Vedic paradigm, it's exactly that. And Maharishi took a completely different point of view, because every one of these things you're talking about, the ego, the intellect, and the mind, Maharishi said, okay, there's an individual ego, but there's also a cosmic ego. I'm going to read you a quote from Maharishi. Somebody just sent it to me.
Sure, I love it.
Squaw Valley, 1968. He says, what we are doing through meditation is we are expanding the ego and expanding the ego and expanding the ego. We're making it big, unbounded, eternal. We're not trying to bring extinction to ego. We are expanding the ego and expanding the ego. We are making our existence unbounded. We are not killing the ego, because what we find is we don't have to try to kill the ego. It's already killed. If we have not if we have not expanded the ego, then every experience kills it. Every experience kills the ego. Where is ego? I say, I see the flower. But then where is the I? Who is the I? Who am I? If the self is out of awareness, then the flower is in awareness. Then if the self is out of knowledge, then what is the basis of knowledge? That means that this knowledge is false. For this reason, we don't blame the ego. We expand the ego, make the ego bigger, make it universal ego, big, huge. From that level, we are able to retain that universal ego and yet able to act as an individual by virtue of the nervous system. So it's a
Beautiful,
totally
beautiful.
different point of view.
Sure. Yeah. It's sort of, it's going in an opposite direction that we usually think about ego, the little I.
Yeah. And it's saying, each one of these levels of the mind, it does have a small self, but it has a big self.
Sure.
It does have a small ego, but there's also a cosmic ego. It has a small intellect, but it has a cosmic intellect. So it's almost like they're two versions of us. And these two versions are there. And when we rise to a higher state of consciousness, and we're not eliminating one version, we're just allowing we're creating the ability to experience both simultaneously. So now we have this cosmic self, which is clear, and we have the small self, which is doing all the action. But the cosmic self never leaves us. It's there in the background. And that's this kind of beautiful level of evolution that we still are using our nervous system, but one part of the nervous system is in contact with this unbounded unified field of consciousness, and the other part of the nervous system is the small self doing all the actions we're familiar with. So this was a stage of development, of enlightenment, that Maharishi talked about in a way that I've never heard talked about. It involved the nervous system. It involved these kind of simultaneous states coexisting. It was such a unique and beautiful way of describing enlightenment, or at least this first stage of enlightenment.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. Yeah. I want to actually, there's another section of the book that I like on page 28, and it talks about, where the heck is it here? It talks about impressions, essentially. It says, in ordinary waking consciousness, our experience of anything in the outside world, even a beautiful rose, is like etching a line in a rock. It leaves a deep, long-standing impression that is difficult to erase and overshadows the underlying nature of pure consciousness. And with the regular experience transcending, however, pure consciousness rises more and more into the nature of the mind. Okay. When cosmic consciousness is fully established, Maharishi explains, the impression will be there because the flower will be seen, but it will be like a line on water. It is drawn, it is seen, and yet simultaneously erased. Talk about that, because I think that's important, because
yeah, it's the same thing.
We walk around with these, in talking about Ayurveda, we talk about the srotas, we talk about flow, and we talk about removing obstacles.
Yes.
And to me, these deep, long-lasting impressions that really get lodged in our physiology, they get lodged in our body, these deeply rooted stresses. How do we, is it, we've got the line in the rock versus the line on water. Talk about that.
So it's a rewiring of the nervous system. Our nervous system, when we're not in a higher state of consciousness, like cosmic consciousness, Maharishi would say it's not working properly. And what's interfering with it are these deep-rooted stresses that you describe, which basically we could talk about as abnormalities. They manifest as abnormalities in the nervous system. So it's like having a computer, but we're not really using the full computer. We're not accessing all the databases. We're not accessing its full potential. We're just using some tiny portion of it. We haven't really read the full computer manual. And when we read the full computer manual, it says, oh, you can access this incredible database of all of nature. And that gives you access to this cosmic level of life where you can have direct contact with this unified field of consciousness. Now, once you use your nervous system, your computer correctly, then it has this ability to A, contact the source of creation, this unified field of consciousness. So that's what Maharishi calls your big self. That's this field of pure consciousness. And then simultaneously, you're able to use that computer to interact in the world in the what he calls relative states of consciousness, waking, dreaming, or sleeping. So you get a greater potential use of the computer or nervous system. And without that, you're kind of stuck in a world where everything that is perceived clouds and kind of prevents you from seeing the big picture. So you have an experience of a rose. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but it overshadows the experience that should also be there of this cosmic self, unbounded bliss and happiness. So you get some joy from seeing the flower, but because you're not using the full potential of the nervous system, you're not also getting the ability of the nervous system to access the whole universe at the same time. So that's like the impression, a line in stone. It overshadows your nervous system. The nervous system, those parts of the nervous system which should be able to access unbounded bliss consciousness are suddenly clouded over. And all you see is the rose. You don't see where the rose came from, how it's connected to nature. You don't see its unbounded quality. Once you start to use the full nervous system, it's like a line in water. You see the rose, but it vanishes and you still have the full ocean to see. You still get the ability to be connected to all of nature. And that impression doesn't cloud or overshadow the experience of the self. But it's delicate, this thing, because it comes in stages. People practice meditation, they get a glimpse. Oh, that's the unbound, that's my true self. Wow. But then the nervous system needs to be rewired. So they go back to not having that experience of the unbounded self, and the experience of the rose, of the thorn, of anything overwhelms the nervous system. And so it's got constant.
This process, it takes time to.
It takes time. It's physical.
It's a practice because it's in the physiology. So
yeah, that's exactly right. It's not, if it was just in consciousness, it could happen instantaneously, and it does as an experience.
Yeah.
But then the nervous system has to rewire itself so it can do this all the time.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, beautiful. Another concept you talk about in the book, you reference Ayurveda, of course. You talk about soma and ojas. Could you let us know what they are and why they're important for our health and well-being?
Yeah, I mean, again, Maharishi is so unique in his presentation of this. Ayurveda has, traditionally talked about ojas as the finest product of digestion, something that strengthens the nervous system, allows us to live longer. Maharishi kind of revived this description and said, okay, that's true, but ojas is also something even more. It's a biochemical that's the basis of higher states of consciousness. And then he went to the Vedas, where the same chemical is given a different name. In the Rig Veda, it's called soma. And there it has a broader meaning. It not only means a biochemical that's allowing us to live higher states of consciousness, but it has a meaning which is even beyond that. It's not just a substance, which is more the ojas meaning. The soma reference, even though they're the same concept, the soma says, no, this ojas is more the individual biochemical. The soma version of this same biochemical is that it's connected with everything in the universe. It's the glue of the universe. It's what connects the objective world with the subjective world. So when my nervous system has a subjective experience, it's by virtue of soma. So it's a much more powerful description, but both of them Maharishi defines so uniquely as the biochemical, which is the basis of higher states of consciousness, which is totally in line with the current scientific paradigm, which says every mental state has a corresponding physical state, which is very often a biochemical. Serotonin, adrenaline, cortisol, all these different biochemicals, hormones, neurotransmitters, their underlying our subjective experience. And so when Maharishi talks about ojas/soma as a biochemical that is the basis of higher states of consciousness, that gives us a very concrete measurement and something to look for. So if we can identify that chemical and we can show that people who are in higher states of consciousness produce it more, then we have a very easy way to measure the growth of higher states of consciousness. He really gave us a path by which to find the objective correlates of higher states of consciousness.
Wonderful. I want to turn to page 59 of your book, where you talk about the impact of stress on our health. You ask us to consider this question: where does stress enter the body? How do you respond to this? Well, first of all, that's my question for you. How do you respond to that question? Where does stress enter the body?
It's interesting. I was just reading some articles about this, and let's take a simple example from a modern scientific viewpoint. What happens when you turn on the fight or flight reaction? So say you're on a walk and you see what you think is a snake. And so why do you respond to that? Maybe it's a string. It's not, maybe it's a piece of rope. It's not really a snake or a branch or something. But why do you interpret that as a snake? And why do you turn on a full fight or flight response? So in a sense, your stress, which is good because you want the stress response turned on, because if it is a snake, you want to get out of there, and you want, if it's a poisonous snake especially, you don't want to get bit by it. So you need to react appropriately and quickly. On the other hand, if it's just a branch or a string, it's kind of foolish if everything looks like a snake to you and you're overreacting to everything. So what part of the nervous system is doing that? The same sensory information is coming in. You know, you're looking, you're seeing something, but why does your brain suddenly interpret it one way instead of the other way? Why do you interpret this as dangerous or not dangerous? And it turns out that there is a part of the brain, two really interesting parts of the brain where this takes place. Something called the locus coeruleus, which is in the brainstem, where all sensory information is coming through, where our sense of alertness is there. And then, more importantly, a part of the brain called the amygdala, which is pretty much in the center of the brain. It's a very small, almond-shaped, like little organ that sits in the center of the brain. And it is the main interpreter of whether something is dangerous. It's kind of, it regulates all emotions, but fear is its biggest. And so all of our phobias, all of our fears are based upon the circuitry of the amygdala. Well, what does the amygdala do? it bypasses, it hijacks the prefrontal cortex. So it never allows the brain to actually interpret that as a rope or as a snake. It just says, nope, you're a snake, we're going to react. So suddenly the part of the brain which would normally take the time to analyze it and say, oh no, this is nothing, we can just move on, no big deal, it gets hijacked. The amygdala says, no way, I'm not giving that information to the prefrontal cortex. I'm taking that information and I'm shuttling it down to my adrenal glands, to my sympathetic nervous system, hypothalamus, all different areas to jump and get out of the way as quickly as possible. So this one little part of the brain is a huge interpreter of what we should be afraid of. Unfortunately, the brain is a kind of use it or lose it thing. So the more we elicit this stress response, the more the amygdala creates and interprets everything we do as stress, the more stressed out we get. And
yeah, that's interesting. So once we're in overdrive, it's hard to turn it off, is what you're indicating.
And it learns. So it begins to, if you keep getting stressed out, then that amygdala gets more powerful, more information is going to it, and less information is going to the prefrontal cortex. So one circuit builds up, the other circuit gets less attention. And because it's a use it or lose it, it becomes less important.
Yeah, yeah. That actually relates to the other section here in the same section of your book, which talks about, you ask this particular question, how do we increase our coping ability? And you emphasize that the way to remove stress is to go beyond it, to evolve. This seems so simple, and while meditation is mainstream, why isn't this concept mainstream? That was actually my little aside there. You talk about TM, which introduces a state of restful alertness to the nervous system as being not only the most powerful antidote to stress, but the most effective way to remove deeply rooted stress that's already deposited in our nervous system. I understand how TM can be an antidote to our daily stress. But say more about these deeply rooted stresses. We talked about this earlier.
Yeah.
You seem to suggest that they're actually deposited in the body.
Yeah, for sure they are. I mean, we know that children who have been abused are much more likely to be addicted to, drugs, alcohol. And we know why, because we know that experience, that childhood abuse, not only rewires the brain, so there's a different wiring there, but it also changes the DNA in what we call epigenetic phenomenon. Different experiences can turn on and off genes. And so it's been shown that people who've had this kind of abuse have a different pattern of gene expression. And so we are physically depositing stress, both in terms of biochemicals. So you might have an imbalance. Most psychiatric disorders are treated as an imbalance in biochemicals in the brain. Likewise, we now know that it's also in the DNA itself, that there's a different expression of genes in people that have undergone severe stress. Same with PTSD, with soldiers that have been under severe stress. Again, it changes the DNA, changes the biochemicals, changes the nervous system. So it is for sure physical. We have very good evidence for that. Now the trick is to show how TM can reverse that. And that's, studies are going on, particularly with PTSD subjects, to show that different genes are being turned on. So there's a kind of, the basic notion is simple, and that is that rest can repair the body. You get sick, you rest, and that repair strengthens the immune system, and you get rid of the germ or microorganism that's causing the problem. If you have a broken bone, rest, the body will repair itself. So same ideas here. If you meditate, you get a deep enough level of rest that these impurities, these abnormalities, these imbalances, these incorrect gene expressions are naturally corrected by the body. And that the body can do this if it's given time and attention. It's just that most of our attention is directed outward. So the body and the nervous system doesn't have time to make the correction. When we go inward, we create a very deep state of restful alertness, and that enables the body to repair itself in terms of these structural abnormalities, which we could refer to as stress.
Great, awesome. I know we're coming toward the. I could go for another 10 minutes. Would that work for you?
Sure.
Okay, cool. I wanted to turn a little bit to Maharishi Ayurveda. You talk about Maharishi Ayurveda in your book, and you indicate that Maharishi Ayurveda gives us 20 approaches to improve our health and longevity. You talk about, in relation to Ayurveda, the mistake of the intellect, and I'm going to quote from page 96 of your book. Maharshi explained that imbalances arise in the body, leading to pain, sickness, and suffering whenever the process of manifestation of intelligence into matter loses its self-referral quality. That is, it becomes disconnected from the underlying unity of life, the intellect, our deciding discernment capacity, which plays a central role in maintaining balance by maintaining the connection to self with a capital S. It is the fineness of the intellect which maintains the self-referral state. In this state, the intellect is completely coordinated with self. There, the three values of Rishi, Devata, Chandas emerge from one state samhita. If the intellect is balanced, then everything is clear. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, now we're getting the deep theoretical basis of the Vedic paradigm, which Maharishi spent hundreds and hundreds of hours going over. And it's simply what we said before. It's big self and small self coexisting. So if we use this word self-referral, it's a very, it's a cryptic word because we don't know.
It's not a word that people necessarily access easily.
No. And what do we mean by it? Well, it has a certain special meaning for Maharishi. Essentially, it means that the self is able to interact with the self. It doesn't need anything from the outside. There's a similar phenomena in physics where we see the self-interacting dynamics of the unified field. The unified field doesn't need anything from the outside. It has the ability to interact with itself, and from the point of view of modern physics, this is the mechanical basis for the manifestation of the unified field. Different parts within it interact with itself, and this give rise to all the elementary particles and forces of nature. So that a similar and even more profound idea is introduced by Maharishi as the basis of the Vedic paradigm, that the unified field of consciousness at the basis of creation has this ability to interact with itself, which Maharishi uses the terminology Rishi, Devata, and Chandas, meaning the knower, process of knowing, and known. So this is now purely subjective. So self-contained within consciousness are these three apparent divisions. They're not really any division because it's just one whole, but for the sake of trying to understand how it works, we say, okay, there's a knower, a process of knowing, and a known. And that is the interaction that's going on within consciousness. And once that, and the samhita is the real deeper understanding that they're all the same, but somehow, even being the same, you can identify qualities of these three. And once these three interact, creation arises. So it's a very highly technical terminology, which is similar to the highly technical terminology in physics. Only physicists can understand that. And this is a highly technical terminology. But what does it mean? It just means that from, if I'm a physiologist and I'm describing it, it just means that I essentially have two parts of my nervous system, one part that's maintaining the big self and one part that's maintaining the small self. The big self is everything, and it is completely self-contained. It has this self-referral dynamics within it. But then I also maintain a small self in which the knower process of knowing doesn't have that unbounded characteristic, but is very bounded. I am looking at the rose. It's me interacting with the rose. And in a normal state of consciousness, that would overshadow everything. In a higher state of consciousness, I've got simultaneously this unbounded state going on in which the knower process of knowing are still lively and totally infinite in their nature. So it's a very interesting kind of paradox where you can have this kind of self-referral maintained, this cosmic self-referral, at the same time you are experiencing something. It's
Awesome. Thank you.
quite complex in its nature, and not easy to completely comprehend,
Yes, definitely. Well, I want to turn to just some words from your index, just to, rapid fire, what comes to mind?
Okay.
Conscious evolution.
Conscious evolution?
Mm-hmm.
I usually think of it as the evolution of consciousness. Okay, conscious evolution means the development of higher states of consciousness, going from waking, dreaming, and sleeping to pure consciousness, to cosmic consciousness, and so forth.
Very awesome. Sattva.
What was that again?
Sattva.
Oh, sattva. Okay, well, again, this is Vedic terminology, but according to the Veda, 3 elementary forces, energies of creation. When consciousness first emerges, it has these what are called the gunas. One guna is sattva, which is very pure, which is very creative. Another is rajas, which is very active. Another, which is tamas, which can be more destructive. And you need the balance between sattva and tamas, between creation and destruction, which is maintained by rajas. So these are like, the equivalent of fundamental forces of nature. And sattva is that creative force of nature, generally representing things. You say a food is sattvic, means it's more pure. It has this, it always helps the body to become more energetic, more creative. You say a food is tamistic, it means, it's going to make you dull and fatigued.
Yeah. Cellular resistance.
Cellular resistance. That's an interesting one. That was in my index. Okay. Can mean a lot of different things.
Well, I may have misspoke, but they're general concepts that I believe in the book. They may not actually be in the index, but
Good. That
Mhm.
because I'm not sure. Cellular resistance could be so many different things. I'm not sure. There's insulin resistance. That means something very specific, that the hormone insulins can't get into a cell. So, but cellular resistance could mean insulin resistance, could mean, something has a difficult time getting in and out of the cell.
Optimal health.
What was that again?
Optimal health.
Oh, optimal health. Okay. Yeah. Well, that is the goal, to create balance in the system. So whatever challenge that's presented to the individual, that individual is able to deal with that challenge effectively and quickly and return to a state of ideal balance.
Neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity is a word that's, now used a great deal. It means basically that the nervous system is very, very flexible and can change. So when you have an experience, that experience causes the nervous system to change. Plasticity is just that flexible ability of the nervous system to rewire itself with every experience you have.
Would you say neuroplasticity has any relation to, the line on water versus the line on the rock?
Absolutely. I've used the word neuroadaptability as a refinement of neuroplasticity. Neuroadaptability is looking at how challenging experiences can create stress or not. And the line on the water and the line on stone is kind of referring to that. Does an experience stress you out? That would be like a line on rock. Or is it something which does not affect you in a stressful way, like a line on water? And the greater neuroadaptability you have, the greater chance you have of making it a line on water instead of a line on stone. How can you recover quickly from a stressful experience?
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Wallace. This was an amazing conversation again. And where can viewers and listeners find you, your website?
The books are all on Amazon under Robert Keith Wallace. And the newest website is called Biohack Longevity. And it is a multi-website which contains a bunch of other websites that I had in the past, and I'm now combined into one. So one focused on Ayurveda called Dosha Guru, another focused on gut health called Doc Gut, another focused on parenting called Dharma Parenting. They're all now included within this one website, Biohack Longevity.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Biohacklongevity.com. I'll make sure I include that in the show notes.
Thanks.